For years, news agencies have had no problem calling groups around the world terror groups. Here's CNN describing the Islamic State, also known as ISIS.
They're not just preaching, they're also recruiting for the world's most reviled terror group, ISIS.
And the BBC describing an Islamist group in Africa.
Boko Haram's campaign of violence has forced many schools to shut down in northeast Nigeria over the past 4 years. More than 200 schoolgirls are still in captivity 7 weeks after being abducted by the terrorist group.
And the New York Times describing another Islamist group in this conversation from The Daily.
She comes from a southern part of Somalia that is held entirely by a terrorist group called Al-Shabaab.
And it's not just Islamist groups. There are terrorist groups all over the world. The media discuss neo-Nazi terror groups. A Washington Post headline referred to Peru's Shining Path terrorist group. But when it comes to groups that primarily attack Israel, particularly Hamas, news organizations have spent years actively avoiding the term terrorist. This shows up in all kinds of ways. Here's a CNN report.
Continued infiltrations by Hamas militants. We don't know exactly how many.
She goes on to call them fighters.
Militant Hamas fighters.
And here's one from ABC. Listen to this in the wake of the October 7th massacres.
This morning, Israel under attack. Palestinian militant group Hamas launching a massive, unprecedented military operation.
What? This was not a military operation. This was a terrorist attack. Not only that, this one was the most barbaric terrorist attack of our time, in my entire lifetime. The things that these terrorists did were things that don't even show up in horror movies. It's unreal. This is terror. And yes, we already had enough details by the time of this report to know that. Of course it was a terrorist attack. This issue, the media's avoidance of the term terror when it comes to attacks against Israel, this has been getting more and more attention recently since the October 7th attacks. And ahead, you're going to hear from someone who has some really strong words to say about this during a live interview. But here's what a lot of people don't know. This problem has been the result of rules inside major news outlets that specifically push people to treat Israel differently from the entire rest of the world. It has been this way for decades. I know because I was in the mainstream media and I was subject to these rules and these expectations. This difference is not just about semantics. It goes way beyond that. This has a massive effect on whether people even hear the basic news about what happens in these cases. Today, on They Stand Corrected, why so many news outlets habitually refuse to call terrorist groups when they primarily target Jewish people in the tiny dot of a Jewish state. Also, the surreal gaslighting arguments that some news agencies are now using to try to justify what they're doing, and the real reason for all this that some news executives admit when I talk to them off the record. It's as bad as you think. Maybe even worse. All that coming up. All right, let's dig into this issue. Hi, I'm Josh Lebs. For those of you who don't know, I spent 20 years inside mainstream media. Did a lot of fact-checking on air and online back at CNN. And then I wrote a book and then launched my own communications business. And since I've been outside of the industry, been able to see more clearly than ever what the problems are inside. In order to understand this episode, you need to listen to the previous one first about occupation. Certain things will not make sense to you unless you hear that one first. So if you have not yet heard that episode, be sure to go back and listen to that one, then come over here. Let's focus now on this ridiculous double standard on use of the word terror. The head of the ADL called this out, Jonathan Greenblatt. He was being interviewed on MSNBC. Here's what he said.
But I've got to ask, who is writing the scripts? Hamas? The people who did this, they are not fighters, Jonathan. They are not militants, and I'm looking right at the camera. They are terrorists. It is a barbarian who rapes and brutalizes women.
He's absolutely right, but he shouldn't have to say that. This system of avoiding the terrorist label when it comes to Hamas, when it comes to attacks against Israel, this system has been in place for so many years. Now, to be fair, I will tell you there are some times when news agencies have called Hamas what it is, a terrorist group. You have to go digging for these, and if you look hard enough, you can find them. In fact, when I was preparing this episode, I found a few cases after October 7th in which people at CNN on the air did call Hamas what it is, a terrorist organization. But the irony of that is that when that happens, in general, it means people are breaking rules. Because as a rule, they're not supposed to. Now, years ago, when I was at CNN, we were specifically given this guidance not to call Hamas a terrorist organization, only to cite that, to say, well, government agencies call Hamas a terrorist group, even though we did call other groups terrorist groups. So when I saw that, I contacted CNN and asked them, hey, have the rules changed? And they, of course, did not want to comment on the record. But there are a couple of news agencies that have talked about their current policies because they have been facing so much blowback over this. There are two in particular that I'm going to tell you about. One is the BBC. The BBC has been refusing to call Hamas a terrorist group, even though they have called lots of other groups terror groups, when people, including the UK Prime Minister, have called them out on this since October 7th. They responded, and what they did was so surreal. This is where gaslighting comes in. The BBC tried to pretend that they've somehow had this rule in place for so long and that it applies equally everywhere. Here's their head of policy and standards speaking about this in an interview on BBC Radio.
BBC's approach to this. I mean, why not just use the word terrorist?
Well, yes, this is a very long-standing policy of the BBC, which is...
That's ridiculous. As you heard at the top, they do call groups terror groups, and they call attacks terror attacks. But they have been super careful to avoid it when it comes to Israel. In fact, after the October 7th attacks, they called an attack in Brussels a terror attack. But when someone pointed that out, they went and changed it. They just didn't want to be caught doing what they have been doing for years. And the other one I'll mention is quite possibly the most impactful, the most influential news organization in the world, and that is the Associated Press, the AP. Most news agencies get AP wires for lots of information and follow the AP style book. So when AP makes a decision, it impacts the news world everywhere. The AP refuses to call Hamas a terrorist group. And when they were called out about this after October 7th, suddenly they claimed the same thing. They were like, who, us? What? No, we have a policy that applies everywhere. This is nonsense. The AP called tons of groups terror groups. In fact, just weeks before the October 7th attacks, they ran a headline about the Islamic State terror group. It's still up right now. Now, the AP says that the term terror should only be used when it's in a quote or attributed to authorities, like the U.S. government designates this group as a terrorist group. That rule could be a totally legitimate rule if it applied equally everywhere, but it obviously doesn't. You can just look at all this coverage and see that it doesn't. Now, there are different ways for media to be unfair. One way would be to have a specific rule that says, well, only when it comes to this area, you have to avoid the word terror. But another way of accomplishing the same thing is to have a rule that is technically on the books, and then you only enforce it at certain times, like when it comes to coverage of Israel. So sure, they might have some rule they can point to, but if they're super careful to make sure never to break it, only for Israel, but it's okay if you break it at other times, that's selective enforcement, which is just another way of being biased. Now, before I dig into the why behind all this, I need to help you understand something. This has an exponential effect on all of the coverage. I mean, you might think, well, as long as they're giving details about what happened, does it really matter if they use that word terror or not? Aha! This is the key. Without use of the word terror, you often don't even find out what happened because of the way that people get so much of their news these days. These days, the overwhelming amount of information that people get comes through headlines and little brief summaries that are like headlines. Here's what people outside the news business don't necessarily realize. There is no room in a headline or just a very quick summary to say members of a group that is listed by the United States government as being a terrorist organization. There isn't room for all that. So when Israel takes military action against terrorists, what do these headlines say instead? Palestinians. Israel kills Palestinians, or just a number of people in Gaza, let's say. Israel kills 5. Well, 5 what? They don't say terrorists. So people over and over for years and years and years have been hearing Israel kills Palestinians, Israel kills Palestinians, Israel kills, followed by a number. Whereas with other parts of the world, they've been hearing authorities kill terrorists, authorities capture terrorists. You don't have to be a brain scientist to understand what this does over years and years. It sanitizes only Palestinians by removing the word terrorism in those headlines, in those brief summaries. There are some studies out there that don't necessarily have strong enough methodologies for me to give you real numbers here, but there are lots of surveys that suggest the overwhelming majority of people only see headlines. Think about it. You see a headline in social media, or you see a tweet, or you see a very quick summary. Over and over for years, this is how it has been working. You can hear about the fight against terrorism elsewhere, but it is removed when you hear about what Israel is up to. Here are just a few examples of the kinds of little news summaries that people have been hearing.
Gunfire and explosions rock a Paris neighborhood. Police target the mastermind of the terror attacks. Residents warned to stay inside, away from windows. A female suicide bomber blows herself up. Another terrorist killed by police. At least 7 arrested.
Happening now, new information about the death of one of the world's most infamous terrorists, Anwar al-Awlaki, killed by an airstrike in Yemen.
More than 20 suspected Islamic terrorists killed by Egyptian airstrikes in Sinai overnight.
The United Nations is on a tight timeline to pull all of its peacekeepers out of Mali by the end of this year, at a time when ISIS and other terrorist groups expand their control over parts of the country.
And here's the kind of thing you hear about Israel.
Israeli soldiers killed at least 6 armed Palestinians in raids in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. It was the first Israeli...
See, in this case, they're armed Palestinians, not terrorists. Or how about this?
An Israeli soldier was freed this morning after 5 years as a prisoner of the Palestinian militant group Hamas. Gilad Shalit was exchanged for hundreds of jailed Palestinians.
Now it's a militant group, not terrorists. And there's a big difference because terrorists specifically, purposely target civilians. And these people are jailed Palestinians as opposed to terrorists. Even though people released in that exchange were convicted of terrorism offenses, they included hundreds of people who perpetrated and planned terrorist attacks. This difference is so omnipresent in media. It happens all the time in ways that we don't even think about. Here, listen to this little take from NPR on something in Germany.
In Germany, police have made arrests in connection with Anis Amri, the Tunisian Islamist terrorist who drove a truck into a Christmas market in Berlin a year ago.
Now listen to this from the West Bank.
And Israel has arrested 2 Palestinian suspects after the fatal shooting of an American Israeli.
Now, in reality, Israel said it was going after terrorists, just as Germany said that. And in this Israel example, these were terrorists who had killed this American who was just in the area visiting for a wedding. They specifically wanted to kill a civilian as part of an effort to terrorize a population. I even went and looked at how NPR handled that whole story in the longer version, and the longer version of that story avoided the word terror altogether. And you can see this all over the media. I'll tell you, when I was pulling up clips to share with you here, it was like going down the most depressing rabbit hole because it's so clear how there has been this double standard for so long. In fact, when I pulled up the NPR website, by the way, my old stomping grounds, I spent 10 years there and loved it. I was looking at these headlines that popped up from years ago, and there were 2 that happened to show up in my search right near each other. Here's one. Israel kills 6 in Gaza incursion. And here's another one that popped up. U.S. intelligence, 2 top al-Qaeda terrorists killed. So you've got al-Qaeda terrorists killed, but Israel kills 6. Well, 6 what? Just 6. That's the whole noun. There are people who are in their 20s and 30s now who grew up hearing this coverage, and it has been drilled into their minds for so long. In this case, they're not terrorists. Everywhere else, worry about terrorism, but not when it involves people in the West Bank and Gaza. And there is no legitimate editorial reason to do this. In fact, the Associated Press even says in its guidance that terrorism is the calculated use of violence, especially against civilians, to create terror, to disrupt and demoralize societies for political ends. That is exactly what terrorist groups are doing all over the world, including those in Gaza and the West Bank. At the very start of my career, I was covering terrorism. In that case, it was domestic terrorism. There were these attacks in Atlanta at the 1996 Olympics and afterwards. In fact, this case was just in the news again very recently. And that was terrorism. This person, this lone wolf terrorist, was trying to terrorize a population through domestic terrorism. So, why is it that news agencies are so afraid to call terrorism terrorism when it comes to attacks against Israel? Well, I'm going to share with you some of the arguments that some have tried to make to justify this craziness, and why all of those arguments fall apart as soon as you look at them, right after this quick break. And we're back. This is They Stand Corrected. I'm Josh Lebs. And you can follow along with tons of links or check them out whenever you have time through my Substack. You'll find it all linked in the show notes or at my website, joshlebs.com, JOSHLEVS. There are excuses that some people use to insist that Hamas in particular not be called a terrorist organization. And I've been seeing and hearing these for so long, and they all are ridiculous. So what I'm going to do now is talk you through some of the arguments that you might hear people use and explain to you why they don't make sense. All right, the first is, well, no. Hamas is just about fighting occupation. All right, this is why you need to listen to the previous episode first so that you understand the background to all this. The very short summary is that there are occupied territories all over the world, and it's not even clear that Gaza or the West Bank are accurately described using that term. Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005, and last year, the Palestinian Authority, which controls the Palestinian areas of the West Bank, they submitted a document to the United Nations about Jericho saying that the Israeli occupation ended in 1994. But anyway, whether that term applies or not, it's still a terrorist organization that purposely organizes and plans terrorist attacks. And tons of terrorist groups all over the world say they are standing against occupations. This is pretty much a standard part of what especially Islamist terrorist groups say. After the September 11th attacks in the United States, there was the 9/11 Commission that looked into them. They talk about the lead up to it. They say Osama bin Laden had declared that it was God's decree that every Muslim should try his utmost to kill any American, military or civilian, anywhere in the world because of American occupation of Islam's holy places and aggression against Muslims. If you look at the terrorist groups around the world, you'll find that very often they're saying they're against occupation, even though what so many of them want is to create a new Islamist empire. And the Arab Islamic Empire historically was built through occupation and enslavement and slaughter and all these things. In many cases, what these groups want is to occupy land, to reoccupy land. Anyway, listen to the previous episode about that. And here's another argument. Some people say, well, hold on, Hamas does other things aside from terrorism. Yes, that also is true for just about every terrorist group in the world. They almost all do other things as well. That's how they get their political support. In many cases, they fill in political vacuums where the government is failing. They come in and do other things as well along with their terrorism. That does not make Hamas unique, and it does not stop a group from being a terrorist group. But here's something people say sometimes specifically about Hamas that's just flat out wrong. Some people say, well, hold on, Hamas is a democratically elected political party. Two things to know when you hear that. One, it's false. And two, it wouldn't really matter because it's still a terrorist group by definition anyway. But let's talk about this false idea that it's democratically elected. Hamas took part in one election ever, all the way back in 2006. Hamas did not get the majority of votes. It did get a plurality, so more votes than anyone else. And according to a democratic system, there would then be some sort of representative power-sharing government. But instead, Hamas and the other major Palestinian political party called Fatah started kidnapping and killing each other's representatives, each other's activists and leaders, and were these warring factions. And then ultimately, Hamas just took over Gaza and never faced another election for everyone to vote. That's not how democracy works, obviously. And some people will say to you, well, not everyone sees them as terrorists. Some people see them in a certain way. Yet that's true for every terrorist group in the world. And this goes back to the idea of what the media's responsibility is. Have the same rule everywhere. If you don't want to call any group a terrorist group, you just want to say it's designated by the U.S. government as a terrorist group, fine. Do that everywhere. Be consistent. But that's obviously, as I've been showing you here, not what happens. Now, I shouldn't have to point this out, but I will. You hear me talking about Islamist terrorist groups because that's what many of them are, including Hamas. But Islamist is not the same as Muslim or Islamic. Islamist refers to Islamic fundamentalist. In fact, overall, by far, most victims of Islamist terrorist groups are Muslim people. These groups have been using terrorism to try to terrorize populations in many Arab and Muslim nations. But when they do it to Israel, suddenly news organizations find this rule on their books saying, nope, don't use the word terror there. It's crazy. It's crucial to understand something I talk about here, and that is standards and practices. News organizations have both. There are standards that are often written, like you shall do this. But just as powerful are the practices. And here's what that means. Once something has published, once something has aired, once something is out there, the rest of the staff sees that that kind of language, that kind of presentation is what's approved, is what's expected. The practices become the standard. What people have done in the past is what you continue to do because the editors have approved it before, so you just stick with that. So news organizations can say, hey, we have this rule, but what are the practices? What actually happens? And when you see regularly them running away from the terror term for attacks against Israel, but using it elsewhere, you can see the bias clearly. When people say that there is anti-Semitism in the media's coverage, very often what we're talking about is this double standard, this separate standard just for this tiny dot of a Jewish state. Now, as you may have heard me say before, a secret of They Stand Corrected is that I am often sharing with you things that people inside news agencies have told me about. They contact me and they say, hey, look at this story that we put out. They're trying to make changes inside, but can't get people to listen. And here's probably the most disturbing part of all. There are news executives who know they have this problem. And when I've spoken with them off the record, they have admitted the really disturbing reason that they do this. All right, quick music break, and then we're back with that. On this show, you will rarely hear me use off-the-record information or off-the-record quotes. That's because there's already way too much of it in the news world. It's overused, it's ridiculous, there shouldn't be so much anonymity. The things I was talking to you about in the previous block, these arguments about not calling Hamas terrorists, those you can find publicly. People say stuff like that publicly all the time. What I'm going to share with you now is what some news executives have said to me when we've had off-the-record conversations. I would love to get some to go on the record with this. So far, they haven't, and you'll hear why. And if you're suspicious of off-the-record information, that's fine, because what matters here is the fact that the news does this, not so much the why, because they need to fix it no matter what their reasoning is. But I will share with you now what some executives have said to me off the record, and it is so wrong. They have said, look, there are a lot of people who are radicalized against Israel. There are a lot of people who hate Israel. There are a lot of people who support Hamas, and we want them to read what we put out, to click on it, to listen to it, to watch it. We want to reach them. And if we call Hamas terrorists, then they won't. This is so disturbing. Or they say, well, we're trying to open a bureau in a specific country, often one of the many Muslim countries. And if we call Hamas terrorists, then they won't work with us. This is not editorial decision-making. And it's giving in to radicalization. And there's a tremendous hypocrisy to this, because a lot of these executives, a lot of these news agencies have no problem calling out Fox and other right-wing media outlets when they try to appeal to people who are radicalized by lies about the 2020 election. All right, follow me here. There are people radicalized by lies about the 2020 election, and Fox and other right-wing media have tried to appeal to them. And lots of news agencies have called out how wrong that is, giving into those lies, supporting those lies. Meanwhile, some of these same news agencies are making their own editorial decisions to try to appeal to people who are radicalized to hate Israel, who believe lies about Israel. They want to reach these massive numbers of people, and that influences their decision-making. This is hypocritical and wrong, not the job of news. Now, they won't admit that in public, and as I said, it doesn't actually matter. What matters is that this happens, as you've heard. So, what can we do about it? Well, here's where the links come in. You'll see linked in my show notes and at my website, joshlebs.com. There is a blog, a Substack that goes with each episode, which has lots of information, including text that you can send to news agencies when you see, hear, read them doing this, using terrorism in one place or the word terror in one place, but not when it comes to Israel. And I talk you through some of these steps. Also, you can send me links. You can send me links to audio content, video content, articles, tweets, whatever it is. And I will reach out to these news agencies. I also work with people at these agencies, and I encourage them to be unafraid to fight for change internally. And some of them, increasingly, are willing to do it. Also, I know people say this all the time, but it's so true. Something powerful that you can do is share this show. Share this episode. Just right now, click the little share button on your app and send it to some people. Because the media responds when they know people are paying attention, when they know that they're coming under a microscope for their bias. That is a very powerful way to affect change. So the more people are listening, the more people are following, the more the media will care. Coming up in the next episode, I'm going to be looking at the term international law and how the media misuses that term, specifically in the context of Israel, all the time. See, when you look at facts, all of a sudden you can see things so clearly. It doesn't have to be all murky and complicated. Whether it's occupation or terror, or in the next episode, international law, what we need is clarity, because truth is facts plus context. All right, that's it for today here on They Stand Corrected. Thank you so much for listening. See you next time.